Before the Moonlight Ends by Anna Dakota. Narrated by Otis Jiry. Snow crunched under Lila's snowshoes while chunky flakes continued to drift from the sky. Given enough time, the white dust could bury anything. The farther they climbed before the sun rose, the more they could ride the mountain that day. And when the morning darkness gave way to the sun, the clock began ticking down, and at sunset they had to go home. Lila's body burned from hiking uphill, and her snowshoes were beginning to drag. Didn't matter. She ignored everything around her and focused on calculating how many runs they could take before the sun set and they had to go home. None of her attention was left over to listen to the ever-present music she felt the mountains singing to her soul. She would hardly look at them until they reached the summit, and then she would spend a few moments enjoying the craggy outcroppings where boulders broke free, the ridgelines where the earth caressed the sky, and the sharp valleys where water and ice played. Ahead of her, puffs of snow piled on Alex's black never-summer snowboard. Above Alex, Josh stomped through the thick powder and forged a trail for the two behind him. The snow lurched beneath her with an ominous crunch. She snapped out of her reverie and put her arms out to balance herself as she fell into the snow. While she looked around, however, nothing was wrong. Her shoes were just as deep as they had been the whole hike. As she stood, glaring at the trees in search of answers, the air got thicker. Moments ago, it had been crispy and too cold to hold scents. Usually, Lila enjoyed the sensation of air too cold for her to smell anything, because that meant the snow wouldn't melt. Now, the lack of forest smells felt eerie and empty. The air grew thick and heavy until it was the consistency of peanut butter. The lack of scent became even more anoxic. Her jaw worked, but she couldn't feel the breath in her throat. She felt herself begin to panic as a weight pressed on her chest. She couldn't expand her ribs. Her body was encased in concrete, though for some inexplicable reason she could see nothing threatening around her. The mountain was peaceful and beautiful in the dawn. As quickly as it came, the feeling passed, and she could breathe again. She gasped in a couple frozen breaths. She resumed hiking, but she hadn't hiked 3 feet before she saw it. A rocky cloud of snow crashed through the trees, swept over them, and sucked them down into darkness. "Alex!" The scream erased the vision, and they were again hiking in the moonlight. Alex jumped and spun around. "What the fuck? Did you see that?" "See what?" Josh stopped and peered down through the thick pine trees at them. "What's wrong?" "I saw an avalanche. It came down through the trees." She pointed uphill where she'd seen the tsunami of powder and heavy blocks of frozen water tumbling down to kill them. "Coming down at us." He glanced up at the quiet forest. He pursed his lips and cocked an eyebrow as if to say, "Where is it now?" Slices of heavy shadows cut through the purple haze. The odd mixture of hues made it hard to distinguish what was there and what wasn't. "I want to go home." Alex dragged on a cigarette, making the cherry glow painfully bright in the darkness. "Go home? What are you talking about?" "I saw an avalanche. It was real, so real I can't describe it. I just want to go home." "Are you nuts? 37 inches of freshies? Please, there will be powder other days. Let's go." She glared uphill, daring the avalanche to repeat itself. Gray smoke steamed out of his nostrils. "No way. If you want to pussy out, go down and wait in the car. Josh and I have some first tracks to make." He turned and trudged uphill. Lila flung her backpack off and ran uphill. Alex could hear her running. "I'm glad you came to your senses." Without responding, she reached up with both hands and grasped the clips of the straps holding his precious snowboard. She pinched the clips, and they snapped open. In the same sweeping motion, she reached down for the lower binding and yanked it up and back, causing the board to straighten out and soar several feet down the mountain before it hit the snow. Alex whipped around. When he saw his board sailing downhill on the perfect fresh powder, he screamed. Lila didn't wait for the rest of his reaction. She leapt off the men's trail and charged uphill through the fresh snow. She struggled breathlessly not to trip over her wide shoes. As soon as she passed Alex, she jumped back into Josh's tracks and sprinted uphill after him. Josh didn't wait for her, and he was a stronger runner. The emergency room in Salt Lake City was home territory to Alex and Lila, who laid Josh on a bed and went to get medical supplies to patch him up. His left arm was broken, as were at least 2 of his ribs, and the blooming bruises threatened internal bleeding. Instead of speaking to Lila, Alex quietly informed Josh of the tests they were going to run and what they were going to do about his rib and arms. Josh listened to Alex, but he kept glancing at Lila. As soon as Lila could see Alex had everything under control, she slipped out of their curtained area and stood staring at the incoming patients. She didn't look like much of a doctor since she was wearing snowshoes, and her hair was sweaty and rumpled after being in a beanie for so long. Nonetheless, no one bothered her. Her eyes trailed unseeing around the emergency room. The memories of the avalanche and the visions that preceded it haunted her. They played over and over in her mind like a broken record of horror. Every replay made fresh chills crawl in her sweaty skin. She hugged herself and tried to think of something else, but the memories crowded tighter around her. Her memory paused for one beautiful second, then a fresh vision appeared. A black-haired man lying in a hospital room. There were no rooms in this part of the hospital, only areas partitioned off with curtains. The man and his room were superimposed over her view of the ER in the double exposure style of the avalanche visions. As she watched, he grunted and rubbed his stomach. Moments later, he was dying. The scene rewound itself, and her focus zoomed in until she was actually inside him, and she could see the inflamed appendix. Without being told, she knew he was on morphine after a painful surgery and hadn't felt the appendicitis. It burst, flooding his body with bacteria and sepsis. The surgeons came and tried to clean him out, but it was too late. Somehow she knew the date was tomorrow. Then the scene zoomed out, all without her control, and she watched him die again. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the man died again and again in front of her anyway. Finally, she opened her eyes and peered through the scene to the present moment in the ER. The black-haired man was sitting in front of her. He was shot through the chest, and he was surrounded by doctors, nurses, and police. One doctor was saying something about surgery to remove the bullet and repair the damaged lung. The man was barely conscious. Without thinking, Lila strode over to them. She could save his life. All she had to do was make sure that the appendix came out. Every day, she saved more people, and with each new person she rescued, the span of time before the death scene lengthened. It only took her a week to see deaths within 5 years. She began to feel like she was losing her mind, but she didn't dare tell anyone because she'd be sent to the psych ward. Instead, she lived surrounded by visions of death. The only way to escape them was to leave the hospital and go somewhere filled only with people who would live 5 years or longer. Finally, Friday came. She went home, relieved to know the only people at home were her roommate and her boyfriend, both of whom were healthy. The instant she unlocked the door, she knew something was wrong. Her sight of the front door blurred, and she recognized the double exposure ghosts coming on. Her hands shook as she opened the door. She could see both men sitting on the couch in the present time. They were smoking hookah, and the room was filled with the perfume of clothes and tobacco. Superimposed over them, another door swung open. It was a hospital door, and behind it was a white bed surrounded by machines. She recognized the whistling puffs of a positive pressure breathing machine. Present-day Alex, healthy and beautiful, looked up. Smoke billowed from his perfect lips. Lila. Future Alex was lying in bed with a CPAP mask over his face, helping him breathe. She couldn't breathe. Her eyes started to water. He put down the hookah mouthpiece and stood up. The Alex in the hospital turned his head to her. He blinked weakly. It was all he could do on his dying day. She knew the ugly close-up was next, and she squeezed her eyes shut defensively. With her eyes closed, she couldn't see today's Alex, only the future one. Her view zoomed into his body, and she could see warty cancers littering his lungs. Bits broke off and entered his bloodstream, and she could see his heart. His sweet, kind heart, the heart she loved so dearly these past years. The heart that stuck by her in med school and throughout their internships and the beginnings of their residencies, was clogged by ugly cancers, and she felt helpless. She could feel the tears in her eyes, but they couldn't wash away the sight of his heart stopping. Blood, cancer, vomit. They were everywhere. Lila could hardly focus well enough to navigate the party. Every time she saw a friend, she immediately saw their death. The mess of visions was impossible to sift through, and she was constantly bumping into someone as she forgot which reality she was living in and tried to walk along a duck-filled park lane or dodge cars on the highway. Josh was standing in front of her, and as she looked at him, she saw his body hit the rocks over and over. He was flailing desperately, wishing he could fly, and then he was dead. She could see all of his broken bones and his hemorrhaging in a vivid montage. And then it rewound, and she was watching him fall again, and she couldn't help but wish this time he'd fly. Standing next to Josh was Alex. His dying smile was hidden by a CPAP machine. He couldn't breathe, and he was drowning in his own fluids, which his esophagus wasn't strong enough to keep in his stomach. She grabbed his shirt. "Please, I can't watch you die." He pushed her off. "I'm not dying." He took another drag on his cigarette. "You've been weird all month. Are you going to snap out of it anytime soon?" "Please, you only have 5 years left. I'm telling you, you're going to die. Please, stop." Tears pricked at her eyes like they often did these days. She was exhausted. She hadn't slept a full night in 3 weeks. Not since she started seeing Alex die every time he was around. The visions were so distracting she could hardly eat. She'd lost 15 pounds so far, a dangerous rate, she knew. But she couldn't make herself eat when she was watching the people around her die. He grabbed her waist. He had a lot of patience, but she was wearing him down. "Lila, quit worrying about when I'm going to die. Keep it up and you won't be around to see it anyway. Just listen to me, please." He threw his hands up in the air. "Okay, I give up. You won't let it go. That's enough. Do you want to move out or me?" The line of sutures was gorgeous, probably the best she'd ever done. Before she was finished, however, another vision popped up. It was the third one in this surgery. Her obese patient seemed determined to die during his triple bypass. It took all of her energy to suppress the shivers. She couldn't take another sight of death. Her patient was dying again. This time, he suffered a stroke from being on bypass too long. All she had to do was tell someone to administer heparin and he would live. In all this time, she hadn't considered why the vision started. She knew why. Even that first one on the mountain, she knew. She wanted them. She invited them. It was her greatest wish to know how everything ended. Her whole life revolved around the likely ending of everything she did. Each time she went snowboarding, she wondered if today she would tear her ACL and never ride at the same level again. She figured if all went well, she could ride until she was 40, maybe 50 if she was really dedicated, but not until 60. And when she was 80, it would definitely be over. She never smoked because she wanted to ride when she was 45. When her birthday came, she didn't calculate how many years she'd been alive, but instead how many she had left in her riding life. It didn't stop with snowboarding. When she saw her family, she worried how much longer they could eat fried chicken and hamburgers until they died of coronary disease. When she made a new friend, she wondered how long it would last before they'd piss each other off and never make up. When she was with Alex, she wondered every day when their relationship would end, starting from the beginning. The first date ended with her wondering if that was it. After 2 months, she felt sure it would end when they graduated med school. When they were interns at the University of Utah's hospital, she knew it would end when they moved to different hospitals for their residencies. 3 months ago, despite the fact they'd been together 6 years, she was still trying to guess when it would end. 2 months ago, she had her answer. He was going to die in 5 years. Heparin. She needed to tell the nurse to administer heparin or this man would die. Would the vision stop if she let him die? No one would know. No other surgeon could know the exact moment a blood clot would form and cause a stroke. Maybe if she just let this man die, it would all end. The seconds were counting on. A few more sutures and she could take him off bypass, but it would be too late. Alex, wait! The moonlight was giving way to the cheery sunrise, but for once Lila didn't count the sight of the sun as the beginning of the end. The snow stopped crunching under his snowshoes. He turned and took a long drag on his cigarette. When he exhaled, the pink dawn light danced on the smoke cloud. What? They were standing on the side of a mountain near Mount Hood, Oregon. Fresh snow had dumped down in the night, and they were on their way to ride back country. They were crossing a clearing between two patches of trees, and piled up before them were craggy, snow-covered mountains. Look, aren't they beautiful? Of course they are. They're mountains. A column of smoke billowed from his lips. I know, I just wanted to share it with you for a minute. They're gorgeous. They're mountains. They're romantic. Blah, blah, blah. First tracks. Come on, let's go. He turned and waved his hand to follow her. He hiked a couple more places, but when he didn't hear her following, he stopped and turned again. You know, my boss asked me yesterday if you'd like to apply for their heart surgeon position. He said he likes my work, and I told him you're the better surgeon. I told you I quit. He grinned sardonically. To be a riding instructor? What better place than Mount Hood? It's open year-round. You're a heart surgeon. You're good. You should do that. I'm a rider first. I love it. I want to spend my days outside with my snow and my mountains, not in a surgery room. You save lives. People die without working hearts. People can't live without mountains. It was hard to argue with her since she quit surgery last year. She'd never been happier. Shaking his head, he turned and continued hiking. He crossed into the trees. After she had her fill of the sun rising over her beloved mountains, she began trudging in Alex's tracks. The snow crunched peacefully for 2 steps, then something snapped. Before she could do anything sensible, the snow in the clearing shifted beneath her. Cracks broke the surface of the snow, then deep fissures widened as the snow broke into heavy boulders of molten crystals. She tried to run, but she was sucked into the swirling snow before she even had time to yell. The last thing she saw was her hands disappearing into rolling pink snow. Her body was sucked into a blackness deeper than a morning without a moon. Boulders of snow crashed into her, and she was tumbling end over end until she had no idea which way was out. The sunrise was over before Alex found her.